Hi there, and welcome to the online Stakeholder Engagement in Systematic Reviews Methods course. In this session, we're going to talk about how to engage with stakeholders. In this first part of that process is focusing on stakeholder identification and analysis. So in the first stage, we want to identify or select our stakeholders. And part of this process involves analysis or mapping sometimes. So stakeholder analysis or stakeholder mapping is referred to identify and categorize stakeholders to get a better grasp of who we're dealing with and what their likely engagement will be. We'll also talk about achieving balance in our stakeholder group, about phasing engagement at different times of the review process, how to go about inviting and continuing to engage with stakeholders, and then we'll talk about some final considerations as well. So what exactly is stakeholder analysis or stakeholder mapping? Well, analyzing our stakeholders is really useful for ensuring that we have a balanced group and that we are covering all our bases with the key demographics that we're looking for. It also helps to prioritize certain groups of stakeholders or certain actors doing particular actions over others where we have a limited amount of resources. So we can't engage with all stakeholders typically within a review. That process would be very expensive and likely take up a whole budget for a systematic review just in the stakeholder engagement part. So we want to try and have meaningful engagement. And by analyzing our stakeholders, it gives us a bit of a picture on which stakeholders are most likely to engage the most, where we're going to be the most efficient and effective. It also helps to identify and then investigate possible conflicts between stakeholders. So by analysing who we're going to be dealing with, it can help us to flag up who might be in conflict and then to mitigate that. It can also help us to tailor specific stakeholder groups, tailor our contact with specific stakeholder groups. So if we know that certain stakeholders deal well with email contact, for example, then we can communicate with them via email. But if we know that some stakeholders like to be in a room physically, then we can take account of that as well. And similarly, if we know that certain stakeholders are most likely to be effective or efficient, if we engage with them at certain stages of the review process, then we can phase contact with them accordingly. And we should do that based on both their utility for the review and the benefits for them as well. And stakeholder analysis is really useful where we're working on systematic reviews where wide communication of findings is what we want to do. So if we want to communicate the findings of our review very widely, something that I've mentioned to you previously as a public good systematic review as opposed to a private good systematic review, then analysing our stakeholders can really help to identify which messages and which communication formats we want to use, as opposed to a private goods review where we kind of know the small group of individuals or organisations who we want to give our review to. So there are two approaches to stakeholder analysis, and you can have a look at this reference for more details. Most approaches are top-down. That means that either systematic reviewers or subject experts classify the stakeholders based on their knowledge of them. For top-down approaches, we need to be quite careful about how transparent we are. We might want to be very transparent in our stakeholder engagement activities, but we need to be careful where we are classifying people. That might not go down very well with certain groups. Bottom-up approaches are where stakeholders typically classify one another. This is really useful when there is conflict or where the legitimacy of the project is a key concern, because we sort of give the reins back to the stakeholders in terms of how they classify one another rather than being classified by an external party. This approach, however, is very resource intensive. You need to have all, or at least most of your stakeholders classify one another, which can take time, and it can be very difficult to achieve sufficient engagement. And so this is why we typically have top-down approaches. So how is it done? Well, often stakeholder analysis or stakeholder mapping is conducted through what's called an interest-influence matrix or something similar. And this is a 4-quadrat matrix across 2 axes, typically one being interest and the other one being influence or power. So what we end up with by classifying across interest and influence, and by interest I mean what interest do they have in the project, and by influence I mean what influence do they have in supporting our goals. We can create 4 different groups where the stakeholders have low interest and low influence or low power. We might put minimum effort into this group. We might want to monitor what they do and what they think, but not really spend a lot of resources engaging with them. Where they have a lot of interest, but not much ability to influence or support our goals, we might want to just keep them informed by having them on a mailing list or something. If we have a group that is very influential but not particularly interested, we might particularly try and increase the interest in this group, try and keep them satisfied, but try and improve their interest and move them into the high interest, high power group. And that's the group that we want to manage closely, because by putting effort into engaging with them, we're able to get quite a lot of support or influence back. So you can use this kind of matrix on other dimensions as well. You might, for example, have amount of evidence that can be provided on one scale versus the engagement effort, or perhaps the social media influence versus engagement cost, particularly if we're interested in communication of the review's findings. But you can use this kind of matrix in a number of different ways. Some other stakeholder analysis methods that I'm not going to go into detail with include semi-structured interviews, social network analysis, and knowledge mapping. You can read more about this in this citation, Stakeholder Analysis, a review from 2000. But these other methods are just some other useful ways of identifying who we're working with, what their interests are, and how they're connected to one another. Moving on to balance in stakeholder engagement. What do we mean by balance? Well, balance is representation of all main interests, views, and opinions. And what it's not is quantitative or proportional representation. So what we're not meaning by balance is that we have the same proportion of people from each stakeholder group as you would find sort of out in the wild, as it were. What we want to do is to try to get a range of different views and not swamp the conversation with the views of the majority. What we want is that all of the relevant groups or individuals, where possible, can have their say. And the aim is to empower marginalized groups so that we hear a range of perspectives that might otherwise not be heard. The thing about balance is that it's most evident when it's absent. So it's most obvious that we've not achieved balance. And it's very difficult to say whether you have balance or not unless it's really clearly lacking, and then you have a real problem. It's also quite difficult to maintain balance throughout a stakeholder engagement process, because the people who we keep engaged and the ones who we end up having in the room after we've identified who we want to have in the room might not be that group that has the balance that we are after. One thing to think of is that we should consider social equity as well as conceptual or role balance. So along with having a balance of different stakeholder groups that represent different views, we might also want to consider various parameters of social equity to make sure that we have as diverse and as supportive environment as possible when we are engaging with stakeholders. So I've talked a bit about phasing stakeholder engagement already, but by identifying who we're dealing with and what their needs and desires and motivations are, we can help to prioritize engaging with different individuals or groups at different stages of the review process. So this is what we call phasing. We identify when certain stakeholders should be engaged, and we can engage those different groups at different stages. The reason that this is useful is that it's resource efficient. It helps us to not spend lots of resources engaging people who can't really help us that much, or maybe aren't that interested in engaging with us at a particular step. But it's also useful for stakeholders who have limited capacity. Often stakeholders will be asked to come to these kind of stakeholder engagement events associated with these projects that we're interested in often. And if we invite lots of stakeholders to every event that we run, we risk really putting them off and not being respectful of their time limitations. So it can really help to reduce wasted time for stakeholders. And this table here just shows the kind of review stages that either early, mid, or final that each of the actions that we've already talked about might occur at. So, for example, sharing own experiences might be really useful early on to help set the context. Endorsing the review might happen all the way throughout the process, whereas facilitating access to the review might be something that we are really just doing at the end. And these actions are either benefiting the review or kind of moving towards stakeholders, or both. And I am sometimes talking about stakeholders here, but actually what I'm really talking about is the actions that those stakeholders will do, as we remember from the definitions session. And this is just a reminder of those actors' roles and actions in the conceptual model that we produced. So before we actually engage stakeholders, once we've identified and categorized them or cataloged them, we want to invite them to engage with us. There are several different types of invitation. You could have an open call where anyone can come along to a meeting, or anyone can engage remotely perhaps. With an open call, there is less risk that we might have selection bias, that we are selecting a biased subset of stakeholders. But there is more risk of imbalance and other biases like self-selection bias. So we might not be selecting particular groups of stakeholders, but they might be self-selecting based on people who really want to have an impact, or perhaps people who are easily able to spend time and come along. And we might also have imbalance because we're not identifying which groups we particularly want to have represented. And then a closed call, which is where we select stakeholders and it's not open. Here there's more risk of selection bias because we are identifying who we want to come along. But there is more ability to control that balance with a closed group than there is if we just let anyone come along who's interested. Once we've decided who we want to invite, then we need to decide how to invite them. And we might want to write them an email, we might want to write them a physical letter. That might want to be someone who we speak to personally, maybe invite them by visiting their office or at a conference. And as well, we might want to think carefully about whether we have a person who we name on the invitation, or whether we invite a particular position or a particular group with our invitation. It might be considered more successful if we have a named person we want to invite. So once we've decided these things, we need to plan our engagement carefully. We need to think about how we're going to engage during our review. Is this going to be via group meetings, or maybe meeting people individually? Perhaps we want to have telephone conversations with certain stakeholders, or Skype or remote meetings. Perhaps we want to communicate with them by email, or perhaps we want to have a questionnaire that we ask them to fill in. We might also want to choose different methods of engagement for different actors doing different roles in our review. This kind of tailored contact. We might choose to have a combination where we perhaps think that certain groups might be amenable to meeting physically together, whereas other stakeholders we might want to meet individually. It might also be worth thinking about the relative merits of having physical meetings where we ask lots of people to come along and spend time getting to and being at a particular meeting, relative to just having a phone call or maybe some kind of remote contact. That might be much more efficient for them. So if we're asking people to give up their time, we might want to be very respectful of which methods are going to be most favorable to them. And then we need to think about what we want to ask. Do we want to ask them for support? Do we want to perhaps ask them to provide us with information or give us advice? Are we just asking for them to endorse the review? Are we asking for their comments and opinions or feedback on some of our methodology or some of our documentation? And do we want to ask them for suggestions of places to look, for example, for evidence? We need to be very clear about what we're asking for and when. And that when is something that's largely up to us if we want to phase contact with our stakeholders, but we might want to be respectful of certain times of the year when stakeholders are particularly busy and give them prior warning, or try and book them in early if we really need to speak to them. And then how to ask. We need to be careful about the terminology and explanations that we use. Perhaps they're not familiar with systematic reviews, and we want to be cognizant of the fact that they might be swamped by some of that terminology and some of those explanations. We should also think about how much do they really need to know to provide us with reliable information, or how much do we want to provide them with new information if what we're really asking for is to listen to them come and tell us their opinions. It might take a long time to explain systematic reviews to them, but actually what they might really want to do is just to have us listen and hear what they have to say. So we should be careful about fatiguing them with long meetings that aren't very useful for them. And when we do ask them for things, it's really important to give them clear objectives of what we're expecting and also how we're going to use the information that they give us. And there might be legal repercussions if we are asking them for certain types of information. We might need ethical approval. So some of the considerations, just finally, is that we need to balance the need for transparency with the need for sensitivity. So if we are using a top-down approach to classify stakeholders, we might need to be quite careful about what we think. Just putting a label on a stakeholder might be considered quite inflammatory by that stakeholder. We should be aware of balance and power in the group who are identifying and analysing the stakeholders. So if it's the review team who are identifying and analysing stakeholders, we should be sensitive to the fact that there might be a power imbalance historically, and there might be a lack of balance in our review group compared to the groups who we're trying to identify. So having stakeholders represented in the review group might go a long way to reduce that risk. We should also be reasonable and feasible in what we're expecting of our stakeholders. So we might identify someone really influential that we can try to invite to engage, but is it really feasible that that person, or really likely that that person is going to get involved? Is it better to spend time building up new connections rather than inviting the head of a large organization who we might have met once? Also, don't ask for too much. There are a lot of researchers asking for input from stakeholders around the world in different subject areas. Some groups, particularly Indigenous groups, are continually being asked for their input into projects, and they have to be very selective. So if you are going to ask certain groups, be clear that you might perhaps not be asking too much from them. Be very open about what you're asking for from them from the start, and be respectful of the fact that they might have to prioritize other groups ahead of yours. So in summary, hopefully we've seen that there's a need for careful consideration and planning when we identify or try to identify a balanced group of stakeholders that we want to engage with. We might want to think carefully about who we've got in the room or who we've got on our stakeholder board or stakeholder group, and thinking carefully about balance and power and the protection of marginalized groups might be something we really want to be careful with, particularly if we're working in an area of conflict. Thinking about how we engage with stakeholders at the early stages, we should think about empowerment. So we should, if you remember the modes of stakeholder engagement from informing to empowerment, we should try to be on the empowerment by listening and by being sensitive to what stakeholders want from the process as well as what we want. And when thinking about when we engage with stakeholders, try to be efficient in our planning of who we want to engage with, how and when, so that we're not wasting people's time, but so that we're also not wasting resources, and that we can be as efficient as possible. So now we're going to hand over to you for a practical exercise. We've produced a hypothetical case study stakeholder mapping exercise. This is for a systematic review on the impacts of metal mining on social ecological systems in the Arctic that's being conducted by the Arctic Environment and Development Council. So what we've done is provide you with some stakeholder profiles. We want you to read those profiles and individually fill in an engagement analysis form for each stakeholder group. Once you've done that by filling in the form describing each stakeholder as best you can given the information that you have, try and place them on the interest-influence matrix. You can shuffle them around, move them around based on where you think they're best suited, and then describe your thinking in the discussion group. So you can follow the link to the discussion group. Just write a short paragraph about what you thought of the process. Thanks very much.